So I have like these coughing fits. I'm trying to avoid them, but just FYI. Great. I think we are live. So hello, everyone who's joining us through the live stream on the ASA YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Marisol Lebron. I'm an associate professor of feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. I'm also the president of the Puerto Rican Studies Association and a member of the executive committee of the American Studies Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion, even though it's obviously a difficult topic, intense topic for our discussion today, defending academic freedom against anti-woke and anti-queer and trans attacks, which is co-sponsored by the American Studies Association and the Puerto Rican Studies Association. Like many of you, we've watched with growing alarm as a spate of hateful legislation and executive orders have swept the country, including bills targeting trans-affirming care and drag shows, Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, and the targeting of critical race theory and so-called woke curriculum. Educational spaces have become a particular target of coordinated right-wing campaigns as we've seen books banned, curriculum curtailed, and efforts to purge teachers who fail to conform to narrow and simplistic ideas of US history. While K through 12 educators have certainly borne the brunt of these attacks, those of us who work at institutions of higher education have certainly not been immune, as legislators seem determined to cut funding and eradicate tenure. As organizations deeply committed to the rigorous study of histories, legacies, and contemporary manifestations of power structures and relations rooted in race, gender, sexuality, citizenship, and ability, among other identities, the American Studies Association and the Puerto Rican Studies Association have assembled a group of scholars to discuss the impact of these legislative efforts and how we can respond as concerned individuals as well as scholarly organizations. So in terms of the format for today, I'll briefly introduce our panelists and ask them to give some remarks. After, I have some questions to put the panelists in conversation. We'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience, which you can pose using the chat function on the YouTube live stream page. And before I introduce the panelists, it should go without saying that we're all here today as individuals concerned about what is happening. Affiliations are stated for identification purposes, and we're not speaking on behalf of our institutions. So bears repeating in these times. So first, I'd like to introduce Mónica Jiménez. Mónica is a poet and historian. She's an assistant professor of African and African diaspora studies at UT Austin. Her research and writing explore the intersections of law, race, and empire in Latin America and the Caribbean. Her book manuscript, Making Never Never Land, Race and Law in the Creation of Puerto Rico, which offers a legal history of race and exception in the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico, is forthcoming from UNC Press. Mónica is also a member at large for the Puerto Rican Studies Association. Next, we have Sharon Holland. Sharon works across the fields of Black, feminist, critical race, and queer studies. She is the Townsend Ludington Distinguished Professor in American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's the author of Raising the Dead, Readings of Death and Black Subjectivity and the Erotic Life of Racism. She is also the co-author of a collection of transatlantic Afro-Native criticism with Taya Miles entitled Crossing Waters, Crossing Worlds, the African Diaspora in Indian Country. At the onset of the pandemic, she became the co-founder of the QTIPOC Survival Fund, a partnership with community organizations to distribute wealth and foster self-determination by putting survival funds directly into the hands of the most vulnerable queer, two-spirit, transgender, gender nonconforming community members in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. Lastly, and certainly not least, Sharon is president-elect of the American Studies Association. Next, we have Larry LaFontaine-Stokes, whose work explores queer, LGBT, Hispanic, Caribbean studies, as well as Latinx and Latin American literary, cultural, and performance studies. He is a professor of Spanish, American Studies, and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan. He's the author of Queer Ricans, Cultures and Sexualities in the Diaspora, and most recently, Translocas, The Politics of Puerto Rican Drag and Trans Performance. He's currently working on a book on contemporary performance in Puerto Rico, which looks at artists such as Awilda Rodriguez Lora, Macha Colon, Eduardo Alegría, and Mickey Negron. And last but certainly not least, Jillian Hernandez is a scholar, community arts educator, curator, and creative. She is an associate professor at the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Research at the University of Florida. Her book, Aesthetics of Excess, The Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment, traces how the body practices and art making of Black and Latinx women and girls are intertwined, and how their creative work complicates conventional notions of cultural value and sexual respectability. Her scholarship is based on and inspired by over a decade of community arts work with Black and Latinx girls in Miami, Florida, through the Woman on the Rise program she established at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami, in addition to her practice as an artist and a curator. So we have assembled a distinguished panel here to discuss these issues. Again, feel free to comment using the chat function through the live stream on YouTube. So Monica, if you don't mind getting us started, we'll kind of go in the order that I presented you. So Monica, take it away.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Marisol, and everyone else for being here. And thank you to the ASA and the PRSA for hosting this. Really, really timely, unfortunately urgent discussion that we're going to have today. So I just want to talk a little bit about what's happening in Texas. And we are deep in our legislative session here. So we have all of this sort of rhetoric and talk happening right now. Proposed bills are on the table. This all kind of started in like a kind of frenzied way last year when UT's Faculty Senate, along with many other faculty senates across the US, issued a resolution in defense of academic freedom and in defense of teaching race and gender. And, you know, we were not the only ones to do it, but it really angered our politicians, and in particular, our lieutenant governor, who quickly responded. And it has become clear that that sort of set off what was, I think, already in the air, but it really sort of sparked off what has come since. So in the immediate response to that resolution, the lieutenant governor came out saying, you know, we're going to do away with tenure and we're going to do away with CRT, and anyone who is teaching CRT will be denied tenure or stripped of tenure if they already have it. And of course, we know that CRT has become this sort of giant basket in which all sorts of things have been thrown in, and conservative activists have just sort of used it as a stand-in, as a boogeyman for everything that they find offensive about the ideas that we teach and we study and we research. So we all sort of waited to see what these bills would look like. So the particularity of the Texas legislative or the Texas governance system is that the lieutenant governor is actually the head of our Senate. So he is able to sort of set a list of priority bills that he finds important, and the Senate has to see those bills first. So it's like the list of priorities is the governor's priorities and then the lieutenant governor's. And our governor has been kind of quiet on some of these issues. He's come out against DEI pretty strongly. He's been kind of quiet on the tenure stuff, but he does have presidential aspirations. So we know that in some ways he is sort of seeing what is happening around him and what he needs to do, right? So he's very much a political animal. So that's kind of the landscape. A lot of this, the impetus is coming from the lieutenant governor, who would like to be governor next. So there's also the politics of Texas sort of underplaying all this, the sort of national conservative politics and with the particularities of Texas. So, you know, we waited to find out what would the language of these bills be? Would they come out? What would they say? And they did. In the meantime, you know, faculty have been talking to each other about what can we do? How do we prepare for these things? we have been in touch with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They have been present in some of these other states. I know they've been present in Florida and in South Carolina, I believe. And so they also have been present here and just sort of observing and waiting to see if these bills pass, how they can be fought in court. So what the bills are, the sort of major ones that are going to go before the House starting this week. So the Senate passed all of the priority bills, and they are now going to the House. The big ones that we've been watching, the Senate bills, Senate Bill 15 is called, in quote, Protecting Women's College Sports. It's an anti-trans bill. There are a whole host of other bills that are anti-drag show, anti-trans medical care, right? Just a slew of these bills. The ones that are sort of higher ed specific that we've been watching are these ones against to protect women's sports, to ban critical race theory in teaching. This is a very broad bill. The language is so big, it says everything and nothing, right? You can put everything into it, but also it can mean nothing. And then banning all DEI initiatives, the spending of money on DEI. There's been a rider attached to the House budget that would basically ban any money allocated in any higher ed context to DEI. And of course, DEI also has become this kind of big empty word that is often conflated with CRT, right? It's just, they become very meaningless in the kind of political rhetoric. And then the other bill is the elimination of tenure. Marisol, I'm so sorry, I didn't check on the time, so please stop me if I'm getting long. Where they stand now, the House, the Senate, because it's sort of controlled by the Lieutenant Governor, he sets the priorities. It was sort of a foregone conclusion that these bills would pass in the Senate. So then the question of what happens in the House, there's some ambivalence in the House about doing away with tenure, as the bill is stated now, because of its financial impacts on higher ed and, the prestige of Texas universities and, federal grants for science, for the sciences in particular. So that seems to be, kind of less likely. However, the other bills are very likely going to pass in some form, right? So there may be some carve outs for some of this DEI stuff. They might soften the language on the CRT stuff. The anti-trans bills, I think, are going to pass as harshly as they are currently stated, right? So that's kind of where we're at. We continue to organize. There's been groups of us who've been testifying at the Senate with ambivalence, right? Because what good is sort of this liberal political project of going and testifying, how in a state like Texas, where it is a sort of super majority Republican, how effective is that strategy? In part, we have undertaken that strategy because we recognize that from a kind of legal record standpoint, our voices need to be there for when there is injunctive action on the legal front, right? We are basically making a case for why these things are unlawful and why they shouldn't pass, or why they should not have passed if they do pass. But I think many of us understand that, the politics are against us, the numbers are against us. So we are, doing all that we know to do. We are participating in the National Day of Freedom actions, Freedom to Teach actions. Thank you, Marisol. Tomorrow. So there will be a rally here in Austin at the Texas Capitol, and we invite anyone who can make it to Austin. And as a plug, there is transportation being offered from Houston for those who might want to come but have a hard time getting here. And just to raise our voices and be seen, and continue to fight in all the ways that we can, having these conversations, obviously, making people aware of what is actually at stake. It's interesting because sometimes when you talk to people, the buzzwords have seeped in, but they don't actually know, they don't know what we do, right? They don't know what tenure is. They don't have a sense of what CRT or DEI actually is, right? They don't know that DEI protects, veterans, rural students, in a state like Texas, that really matters, right? So for us, here in Texas, we're doing all that we can with the knowledge that, the stakes, things are stacked up against us. But it is heartening to see that there is, across the state at different universities, quite a lot of support for what we do, right? For the work that we do, for the need to teach it, for the need to have the freedom to teach it in the way that we teach it, for us to be present in spaces, right? For trans students to be able to live and be and flourish. So I'll stop there, and I welcome the discussion afterwards, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues here on this panel. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Monica. Sharon, you're up.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Marisol, Larry, Jillian. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I'm going to speak to the spate of anti-LGBTQ bills and initiatives, not only a certain kind of history of those bills and initiatives, but a little bit of what's happening in our state. You know, the American Civil Liberties Union right now is tracking up to 471 bills as of April 3rd that have been introduced and or signed during the legislative sessions. The following states, and hold on, it's a long list: Arizona, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Mississippi, my home state of North Carolina, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia, all have more than 10 bills each. These bills are wide-ranging and broad in scope, and actually, lest our Southern folks get short shrift here, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, and New Jersey have all introduced bills targeting LGBT communities and or healthcare and or educational diversity of mind through severe limitations on curriculum in schools and education in general. In short, it should be no surprise to us that these kinds of initiatives in predominantly Republican-led legislatures all come forward at the same time. And I think this is crucial and the reason why we're having this discussion today. Taken together, the limitations to intellectual freedoms are especially curtailed. And I'll explain a little bit about that here. But we have seen this before. In the second term of the Obama administration, we saw a spate of anti-LGBTQ activity around same-sex marriage. I know many of us remember that. And this activity popped up across the country in the form of ballot initiatives, referendums, and other legislative instruments. In my own state of North Carolina, that came in the form of Amendment 1, an amendment to the state's constitution, which passed in 2012 and prohibited the state from recognizing or performing same-sex marriages. I remember getting into a conversation with a neighbor who was advocating for the amendment. They were adamant that it was time for the state to outlaw gay marriage. When I told them that we had already outlawed it in 1996 by a legislative bill passed at 41-4, they seemed perplexed. I told them that a constitutional amendment was a much more serious endeavor and encompassed not only the right to marry, but also adoption, child and hospital visitation, and single-parent families, thus putting our state's capacity to care for its residents, especially its children, to the extent that care is assumed, in grave jeopardy. The amendment obviously was struck down in U.S. District Court in October of 2014, mostly in the wake of the SCOTUS DOMA decision in 2013. What these bills do is leave an already vulnerable population of persons at the mercy of educators who might not be trained or equipped to adequately discern that what the way forward might be for their library or classroom or community event. And I want to even back up here a bit. In working on the ground against Amendment 1, which did pass, I think 60 to 40 in our state, it became very clear to me that even those advocating for it were untrained in how to advocate for it, and were going on basis of knowledge that was actually not a truth. This person was surprised that we'd already had an anti-gay marriage bill on the books, and was wondering why we needed an amendment. And I said, that is precisely right our question here, and I would love to engage with you in that conversation. Moreover, these laws unjustly criminalize our presence in the public domain and produce further police presence in our schools and communities as members call on authorities to adjudicate on the matter of LGBT concerns in the law when such attention is neither necessary or warranted. In addition, they further involve mental health and medical communities who don't always have our best interest at heart, like in terms of the bills that are about anti-trans bills that are about young people participating in sports. Who is actually going to make this determination? Medical experts are brought to bear. Children are put, young adults are put under examination. And, you know, this is a grave violation of their sense of self and their right to be who they are in the public domain. It is important to run down a few features of these pieces of legislation as they affect not only individuals, but also the institutions that serve them, making it very difficult to determine just who in the public domain should be the one to enforce such laws and their various confusing and unspecified provisions. So number one, anti-LGBT laws that target medically necessary healthcare do two things. They target affirming care for trans youth, creating criminal penalties for anyone who provides such care. So we have to ask ourselves, what's care, right? What does this mean? Does this mean someone driving someone to see a therapist, right? Does this mean someone driving someone to something, but not from something? You see what I'm saying? I think it's very important for us to understand that these are laws under discussion that don't necessarily have any infrastructure, and they require loose negotiations loose negotiations among responsible parties, which always already lead to harm if we're not all on the same page. They often block funding for medical centers who offer such care or insurance coverage for healthcare for transgender youth. Secondly, anti-LGBT laws that focus upon public accommodations seek to prohibit transgender people from using facilities like public bathrooms and locker rooms. As you all might know, North Carolina put forth House Bill 2. It was written to require that people use public restrooms corresponding to their birth gender, although it also baked in a host of other anti-LGBT components. And these other provisions in these bills are the ones that people aren't watching as closely, but they affect not just LGBTQ communities. The law spurned a wave of criticism, and it cost the state $3.76 billion in economic activity as companies and other folks decided not to have their events here. Thank you, I'm almost done. Anti-LGBTQ laws that focus on schools and education prevent trans students from participating in sports. As I said before, they force teachers to out students to their parents if they are using a different name or gender in class. They prohibit the circulation of LGBTQ themed books and curriculum in public schools. And as far as civil rights, they overall weaken non-discrimination laws by allowing employers, businesses, and even hospitals to refuse LGBTQ people equal treatment. They suppress free speech and expression, something dear to my heart as an academic and as an educator, by restricting how and when LGBTQ people participate in their own stories, have access to affirming information about themselves, or produce drag shows as cultural events belonging to a wide swath of the community. And finally, they limit the updating of state IDs, thus affecting both safety and ability to travel outside the state, which means you can be refused by TSA if your ID doesn't match your ticket, et cetera, and your name. What can we do? 4 things. And first things, get involved. It doesn't take a very large group. A few deeply concerned people can hold meetings with social justice-oriented constituencies and begin to make their voices heard. Second, reach out to local restaurants and music venues. Get them to sign on to anti-hate and provide a proactive stance on anti-LGBTQ measures, like a commitment to having a certain amount of proceeds go to a fund for LGBTQ folks working to fight these heinous acts. Create and circulate facts, not fiction. Let folks who think these bills harm only LGBTQ people know the other provisions in the bills that affect the very fabric of the quality of dissent baked into our culture and its efficacy. And finally, and this is a plug for the work that I do with my community organizers, who I want to give a shout out to today, Tiz Giordano, Omni Galactic, and others who work on the Cutie Pock Fund. Form a mutual aid fund, redistribute wealth. You know, we cannot do any of this work without resources. So thank you so much for giving me little bit of time here to talk about what's going on in this nation.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Larry, please.
So good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Marisol, for hosting this panel, which so far has been really informative and transformative with such powerful presentations by Professor Mónica Jiménez and by Professor Sharon Holland. I'm also really looking forward to hearing Professor Jillian Hernandez share her thoughts. So we have so far heard very much about the impact of these laws and initiatives and debates in Texas. Professor Holland gave us an opportunity to see a broader perspective, listing a very large number of states, including the state where she lives, North Carolina, not mentioning the two locations that I am most actively involved in. As you heard initially, I teach at the University of Michigan, and Michigan, being a swing state, has a very interesting and complex history in which in very specific moments, there has been very regressive policies. For example, pioneering in the nation, banning affirmative action. But currently, at this moment in which there is a Democratic governor, the Democrats are in control of the state Senate and House for the first time in more than 20 or 30 years. It seems to be a more progressive and open space. And for that, I am very thankful, although that is always profoundly unstable. And we always have to be alert to small and big initiatives. And of course, there is enormous amounts of homophobia, transphobia, and racism. So even if these are not being discussed in the state legislature, they are still very much something that students, faculty, and staff, people of color, queer people, LGBT people have to negotiate as part of the experience of living in the state of Michigan. In Puerto Rico, where I am from and where I am speaking from right now, the University of Puerto Rico has faced radical defunding at the same time that the University of Puerto Rico is one of, if not the most important place on the island or in the archipelago, precisely for the discussion of race, of racism, anti-racism, of queerness, of gender and sexuality. Interestingly enough, private funders, nonprofits, organizations such as the Rockefeller have funded initiatives at the University of Puerto Rico so that, for example, you now have a brand new Afro-Puerto Rican studies or a center focusing on the African diaspora experience in Puerto Rico. So in a context in which many conservatives would prefer to shut the university down. At the same time, you have historic sites such as the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, which for nearly 20 years has been the site of a queer studies conference, Del Otro Lado, Perspectivas Queer, which has been a biannual conference, which has been absolutely transformative and which really operates without a budget. It operates on volunteer work. It operates without sustained funding from the university. So it is actually remarkable that so much cutting-edge, transformative, and socially committed research on issues of race, racism, gender, sexuality, and queerness comes out of Puerto Rico, given all of the constraints. In the state of Michigan, as I mentioned, at least to this moment, I feel comfortable and I am thankful as an openly gay, cisgender, Puerto Rican, Latino scholar who writes about LGBT queer topics, who has published a book on transgender performance and who performs in drag. I feel that I have the space in my classroom to teach these classes, that we have the space at the university to have these conversations, that I can do and publish my research so far without worrying about losing my job or about censorship. There are always critiques. There are always disagreements. Not everybody agrees or shares the same perspective or interest. Many people don't see the relevance of these topics. And that is one of the struggles, to see how to convince or to explain to colleagues, to students, to university administration, that this work that we are doing is absolutely transformative that it has major impacts in health, in education, in business, in civic engagement, that you cannot have a fully functional university if you don't account for the complexity, the richness, and the contradictions. The recent efforts to ban drag in Tennessee have been felt very strongly in the state of Michigan, because it is just horrifying to think that people who make their livelihood from a very long-standing form of performance might all of a sudden be out of a job, and that queer people who have benefited for decades, if not centuries, from the camaraderie and the shared space that occurs at a particular type of cabaret or entertainment or theater or performance or parade might not have that opportunity. So many people in Michigan have been very vocal about the efforts to ban drag performance in Tennessee, about the major efforts across the country to ban access for transgender healthcare for transgender individuals. It boggles the mind. In some respects, it is absolutely unthinkable. What kind of violence, what kind of antipathy would motivate hatred, irrational hatred of specific classes which have protected rights? So we have protected rights as people of color, as LGBT people, as minority persons. It makes literally no sense. It is violent and unacceptable. And I think that is why many people are rising to the occasion to denounce this absolutely inappropriate effort to ban the discussion of critical race theory, or in fact, to lie about what critical race theory, a legal framework for understanding bias in our society is, to ban DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, when these are absolutely transformative and expansive categories, as Professor Mónica Jiménez clarified. So I think we have lots of work to do. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this, bringing together two of the leading academic organizations in the United States, the Puerto Rican Studies Association and the American Studies Association. These conversations are absolutely crucial. I'm really looking forward to hear Jillian's presentation and to the questions and comments we might have from the audience and from our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. Jillian.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, PRSA and ASA, for having us. And I just want to further clarify that I am speaking on behalf of myself and not the University of Florida, nor my department. So it has been a turbulent few years in Florida. In the academic context, we, about a year and a half or so ago, had to deal with House Bill 7, which was a bill with really vague language that pretty much targeted the engagement with any concepts that would utilize frameworks of looking at social inequality, power dynamics as it regards race, class, gender, and sexuality. And we were teaching under that framework for, I want to say, probably an academic year's worth of time, 2 semesters or so, until it's now an injunction. So when that happened, that was lifted. And this year, we're also in the same boat as Monica with we're right in the middle of the legislative session with 2 bills also targeting the teaching of such topics in secondary institutions in Florida. So that's Senate Bill 266 and House Bill 999. And those have been variously amended, but initially they, in one version, literally called for the banning of majors in gender studies, particularly, or anything that taught intersectionality or women's studies, and these were inaccurately presented as ideologies and not fields of study. And I think that's one thing that you continue to see in a lot of the language, the legislative language, is that our scholarly frameworks are being framed as not only political frameworks, but as quasi-religious frameworks, in which it's assumed, the language assumes that we are all invested in some kind of conversion of an assumed student, who comes to our courses, and in this framework experiences a kind of imposition of views rather than a learning space, right? And what a lot of this discourse elides is the fact that, at least in my university, like you could come and like never set foot in my class, right? Like this idea of students being compelled, right, is just not factual. So so the ban on the particular department and these particular departments, that's been removed from the Senate bill. But you can imagine that in many ways that has already affected the climate in our university, and it has been successful in leading many faculty members to depart from the university and take positions elsewhere. So on the one hand, of course, it's crucial whether these bills pass or not, but we're definitely understanding that even before anything happens, right, they're already causing the flight of folks who are feeling unsafe for their physical person, unsafe for their careers, unsafe for their in terms of their communities, or even just their right to share their thoughts. And so we're dealing also with this contradiction and paradox that these bills try to create more freedom or diverse viewpoints on campus, when what is very clear, if you analyze the language, is that a very particular kind of ideology and standpoint is what is being targeted here very particularly. And so I'm doing my best right now to just have conversations with students who are experiencing a lot of anxiety because of these bills. And we don't have a lot of answers for them until we see how everything plays out. And in the meantime, continue to do our work as best we can. There's papers to grade and things to do. And I also have been trying to, in my conversations with folks outside of Florida, try not to exceptionalize Florida or the South. I think it's important for us to understand that the effects of this are wide ranging, and that the Florida is not aberrant here. And that, we definitely want to be attuned to the lack of safety that folks are experiencing through this rhetoric. But I think at the same time, I'm very, very wary of recent discourse encouraging folks not to come to Florida or to leave Florida. I think that's something that certain privileged folks have the ability to do and others don't. And so I'm more interested in what we can do with the folks here and the folks who maybe don't have the luxury to go elsewhere, and to open the question too of like, where else can you go while these kinds of policies are being enacted on such a massive scale. So I think that's what I have for now, but I'm excited to be in more conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for your comments. And Jillian, I actually want to, I think, ask a question based on what you just said, which is, I think there's a kind of tendency to exceptionalize what's happening as either relegated to the South or a problem of public institutions, right? That are so, I think, bound up with the funding that comes from legislators, right? And so, and I know, came from UT before being at UC, and the kind of question of funding from the legislator is live or die every year, right? And so I'm curious, and Jillian, this is a question for you, but also for other panelists, like, is there a way, I think, to make, or what would you say to colleagues who are at private institutions or are outside of the South, right? They might not see that, might see the situation as lamentable, but might not see this as something that directly impacts them, right? I think, what would you say to colleagues that feel that way? How can we think about this as something that actually is all of our problem, right? So Jillian, I asked it to you, and then Monica, if you want to respond, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to have folks out there being paranoid, but I would say to folks, like, be attentive to what's happening, so that maybe you might be able to identify it if you see it, start to sort of encroach upon where you are. But also, I think to just reach out and extend meaningful solidarity to the folks who are in different situations, and sort of checking in with folks, seeing what they might need. I think for students in particular, or those who are doing a lot of mentoring for students and communities. And I think I'm sort of between wanting to tell everyone, the house is burning, but also have like this Bad Bunny moment of like, estamos bien too, because I really don't want to overly buy into this narrative of the South being this abject place, because where I live, there are trans folks and Republican folks who live their day-to-day lives in total community. And this is like the discourse politically in Florida, in my opinion, does not map onto, at least in my community, onto day-to-day relations. So I also don't want to give more credit to the intended goal of this legislation in terms of like what is happening on the ground between folks, and to understand that the South, like LaMonda Horton Stallings talks about so beautifully in A Dirty South Manifesto, which I think is like required reading for all of us right now, is the fact that like the South is the place where these communities have actually created so many frameworks for how you can resist this kind of, authoritarianism. So that's what I have to say.
Monica?
Yeah, a lot of what Jillian was saying resonates with what's happening in Texas in terms of the vagueness of the laws, the way that they're ideological, sort of the way that they've painted our sort of disciplinary affiliations and our subjects as ideologies. Our sort of anti-CRT bill that I was describing is very vague and very broad. The language is that no professor should compel a student to believe, right? And so that's so insidious because there's no definitions. What does it mean to compel, right? How do you define believe, right? If I'm challenging what you know to be what you've been taught, right? If I'm expanding your sort of field of what you know in terms of history, which is what I teach, right? If you'd never heard of a U.S. empire and then I present you with a U.S. empire and you're uncomfortable with that, is that enough, right? Am I compelling you to believe that the U.S. is an empire, right? Like, and that in itself is this kind of insidious language of how do you legislate belief, right? And this was a question that was posed in the Senate hearing, and it's a really slippery, right? Purposefully slippery. So that's the kind of thing that I think is really important, and Jillian is right to point us to, right? We have to talk about the language of these bills. And I think what Sharon was pointing us to as well, right? That affects everybody. It's not just about higher ed. It's not just about Black and brown folks. It's not just about queer and trans folks, right? Every aspect of like your life will be affected by these bills. What you learn, what you can learn, right? Like our medical school right now is in flux. We have this new medical school, and it was posed as this like, community-based medicine, like as a big sort of part of the mission of it. And that is like, there's a huge diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of component to that. So what happens when that's removed from the mission of this medical school? But the one thing that I did want to say in response to the question of private institutions is that the bills are sneakily trying to regulate private universities as well. The anti-trans bill that was posed in Texas, this bill about protecting women's collegiate sports, it would limit the way that private institutions engage with sports as well, right? Because if a private institution is hosting, a trans athlete, right, and like there's this way that that these bills are attempting to regulate private institutions as well, right? They're trying to carve out spaces, and so that's the sneaky thing that's happening too, right? Where if you think, oh, this isn't going to affect me because I teach at a private institution, or I would never send my kid to a public institution, so I don't care. Actually, you should care, right? Because the irony of the party of little governance is that they're actually really, really, really governing right now, right? Like hardcore governing in every sort of aspect. So I think we need to be very, very wary and very aware of how these bills are written and the way that they can sort of, Trojan horse their way into all of these aspects of life.
Sharon, go for it.
Yes, I completely agree with my colleagues. And I think that in North Carolina, they just introduced, of course, House Bill 715. It's called the Higher Education Modernization and Affordability Act, which basically is poised to strike down tenure. And already these bills and these initiatives never think about the back end. And so one of the things that's really interesting that's come forward is that folks are really saying that we need to have classes with our students, some time to teach them what the academic life is all about, from the PhD through tenure. Like, what does it mean to be an adjunct? What does it mean to be a fixed term faculty? What does it mean to do extracurricular activities? What are the 3 parts of a research one institution the faculty have to do? We do research, we teach, and we also perform service. And so I don't think anyone is thinking that, our research one ranking will completely plummet if we cannot assure people that they can be tenure track. Tenure track is what produces, supposedly, at least, the atmosphere of academic, where academic freedom can thrive, and that you can study what you want. You can participate in the life of the mind. You can participate in social justice, right? And I feel like at the ASA, at least, so many of our scholars are scholar activists, and we are engaged in not just thinking about new theory, new thought, but how this new theory and thought might impact our communities. We have done that work. So instead of thinking of us as a resource, right, communities who have tried to figure these things out, or CRT, critical race theory, has tried to figure out why is inequality not work? Why is the dismantling of inequality not working? It was a brilliant question posed by people a decade after civil rights passed, and they realized it's not working for all kinds of reasons, and they headed back to the archive, right? Showing us that an archive is really important, and the people who know how to get around in those spaces tend to be academics. And that's what we arm our students with, the ability to find information, right? And so, no one's thought about, well, what would the University of North Carolina be without tenured faculty? Who are we going to hire? Right. So I think it's really important for us to educate on several levels and educate folks about what it is that we do, especially when university administrations might not feel adequate to that task right now, right? So anyway.
Thank you for these responses. And, I think just also like to Monica's point, and Sharon and Jillian, what you were also saying is also like, we're in an ecosystem, right? We're not isolated from each other. And, as people who are mentoring students, especially graduate students, right? Like, what kind of universities, especially in this job market, are we sending our students into and acting like this doesn't make a difference for them, right? Or for our colleagues. And I think Monica said it as well, like this, and Larry's comments earlier, this colors like the entire environment, right? Like this creep of this idea of wokeness or CRT or, a gender ideology, as Jillian was mentioning, right? This impacts all of us no matter where we are, right? When it becomes normalized as a way of understanding higher ed. So, I think your comments all really highlight the ways in which, this is an issue that all of us face, no matter if we're at a public or a private or in the South or not, right? And that we have to really be really mindful of those kind of divisions, right? And the false safety that they provide for some of us, right? I wanted to bring this up, and Sharon, this kind of dovetails a little bit with your comments, but Dan Royals, who's an associate professor at Florida International University, just wrote a really incredible, really thoughtful piece for the Baffler called The DeSantis School. And, if you haven't read it, please check it out. In it, he makes this important claim about what's happening in Florida as well as around the country. And, he notes that all of these kind of legislative actions or executive orders, they're really tied at the core to kind of labor issues in the university, right? That it's really happening as an effect of, the intense financialization and casualization of the university. So he says, quote, "The working conditions in the neoliberal university have made it especially hard for us to resist the right-wing higher education coup in our state," end quote. And so I'm wondering if you all could comment on this notion, right? The ways in which these are not only about, culture wars, right, in a very obvious way, but that these are also questions about the kind of neoliberalization and financialization of our working conditions, right, and our conditions of learning in the university, right? So this kind of growing reliance on contingent labor, these efforts to discourage unionization and labor actions, the funneling of resources to an already bloated strata of admins, right? How does this all kind of contribute, I think, to this, what we're seeing now?
So, well, I'm happy to jump in because having painted a somewhat positive, I don't want to say rosy, portrayal of Michigan, it is very fair to highlight that currently the graduate students at the University of Michigan are precisely on strike, trying to address these issues of the precarity of life and the challenges of being a student employee, a student teacher, and being able to advance their studies in order to go into a very uncertain job market. Also, in fact, what has been occurring in Florida, especially in terms of the new College of Florida, in many ways has been seen as modeled on a conservative Christian college in Michigan, which is Hillsdale. So even while my life as a privileged professor personally might not be impacted, it is clearly impacted by having graduate students on strike. It is impacted by having people in Florida draw inspiration on very conservative ideas being developed and put into action and manifest in the state of Michigan. So I think that this issue of labor rights are very much, very, very tied together to this broader conversation that we have been having about race, gender, and sexuality.
For sure. I wanted to jump in. Some of the rhetoric behind anti-tenure here, right, is that, professors get lazy, right? They get tenure and then they get lazy. They're not productive. And as justification, right? So that, and Texas is an at-will state, right? So, who should have job security here when we're an at-will state? Certainly not these lazy professors, right? So that's kind of the rhetoric. And the interesting thing is that, of course, there's very little understanding of what tenure is or what it takes to get tenure. I think that's what's really hard is when you actually talk to some of these folks and you're like, this is what it takes to get tenure, right? It's actually a really rigorous process that requires X, Y, and Z years, right? And all of these sorts of things. You see people kind of being like, oh, that's actually not, right? That's not what I thought it was. As well as the idea that, post tenure, you're sort of like wild and free, right? Nobody checks you. You can do whatever you want, right? Like that's not true either. I mean, in Texas, we have, if you don't produce, you're teaching more classes, right? So if you're an unproductive associate professor, you're going to get saddled with 4 classes or 3 classes a semester, right? As an incentive to produce. So just the sort of the notions around which, these anti-tenure sort of discussions about lazy professors are built, right? And the fact is that the language of production itself, right? We have to produce to keep our jobs, right? And how we produce and the quantifying of that production and the like, did you do this much or did you do that much? And thus, did you do enough? All the qualifications or the quantifications, the metrics that are used to sort of gauge whether we're productive enough to keep our jobs, right? Or productive enough to not have to teach an extra class. So I think that the kind of incongruousness, right, of the discussion of lazy professors who don't do anything versus actually what we do and how much we are required to do, right? And toss in there the kind of libertarian notion of our state in particular, right? That like no one should have a secure job, and you just have this kind of like really difficult disconnect of how do you sort of translate the work that we're doing, how much work that we do, to sort of a politics that is predisposed to sort of see us as lazy and our jobs as unnecessary, right? And sort of, one of the legislators was like, because these people that don't have day jobs can be here all day, and like I was like, no, we have day jobs, but you're forcing us to be here all day to testify in front of you, right? Like this is your MO, right? To make us look lazy and like we're here all day. So there's this real like tension for me and for us about like, how do you bridge that kind of, labor understanding of what professors do and the value of that.
I think that the labor analysis is so spot on, because we've seen a lot of changes, a lot of tensions have arisen over COVID, during COVID, when we were all kind of not able to organize as faculty, not being able to be present to one another in faculty senates, not having the discussions in the hallways with one another about things that were concerning to us in terms of the any state legislatures, approach to or understanding of what it is that we do, right? And at that same time, graduate student stipends, went down in across the board in many places, as the standards of living, increased, right? Everything became much more expensive, during COVID and after COVID. The extent to which people had to take care of other family members, children, etc., cisgendered women, the statistics on the amount of productivity they lost over COVID. I feel that this discussion about productivity and what we do coming on the tail of, on the hind end of COVID, which is not really a hind end for so many people, is not, a mistake. It is meant to take those who are already vulnerable at our institutions and make them more vulnerable to being fired. For having to have, the faculty, were amazing across the board. Faculty pivoted to a situation with a technology that did not ensure their safety, right? Or there were no written agreements with the university about whether or not we were being paid to do this work, but we did this work as a labor of love for our students and for the work that we do. They should be having conversations with us now about how to properly compensate, adjunct faculty, all manner of fixed term faculty were brought on to take on some of the COVID weight, right? And those people were summarily let go when we kind of opened our doors again. All of those labor issues are what's brought us to this next step, I believe. So I think the labor issue, the leftover from these 3 years of COVID, really is spot on, really is.
Thank you. Thank you all for the responses. And Sharon, I think that argument, definitely one here at the University of California that we've been hearing, is this feeling of how much faculty shouldered during the course of the pandemic. And now these attempts to kind of roll things back, both on faculty, but also on our graduate students who also, carried their load, right, with teaching and keeping instruction going during the pandemic. Sharon, we actually have a question for you from the audience. Somebody wanted to hear more about the mutual aid that you're doing and how we can think about this mutual aid that you're doing in the context of the discussion we're having, right, about like how to respond to these kind of attacks on academic freedom and organizing with, you know, among colleagues and within university as well.
Well, you know, I'm a child of the HIV/AIDS era, right? And so that first pandemic really, I was in graduate school at the time, and that first pandemic really shaped how I thought about community. Many of us were in that throwaway generation. You know, we could not go home. You know, we had to go to funerals of folks who, you know, people were outed when they, you know, when they had their funerals, when they succumbed to AIDS. And that made a real impression on me. And I had said to myself when I was a graduate student, if it ever happened again, if there a pandemic, if there were another pandemic, I would hopefully be a person of more means so I could do something. And so what we had back then and what we've always had in queer community and in Black community, and in people of color communities that I work in, live in, and trust in and love in, is mutual aid. And so we have a low barrier. I created a low barrier fund with some community organizers in the pandemic. And the reason why our fund is low barrier is that our people do not have to fill out a form in order to get money from us. What they have to do is engage with our organizer and then engage with me. And they're known to other folks in the community, and people know that we do this work. And, you know, we help folks from the transition out of you know, being incarcerated. We help folks on the daily with basic needs. We wanted our people not to have to make, it's a word for it, not to give explanations for what they needed, right? But to actually have to live in community and be supported in what they needed, which is very different. And so we started this and we had no idea what we were doing, but we've grown and we have lots of partnerships. And I guess the core ethic is that there are reparations. There is reterritorialization. There's the work on land, work on community, work on building resources in our community. We can't have abolition without wealth redistribution. It just can't happen. You need resources. And many of those resources, as you know, have been held away from our communities. So what I did was I didn't feel like I could use my cultural capital at the institution anymore. I felt like, you know, what you do when you do that is you become a target and it becomes really hard, right? But I did feel that cultural capital was really current in the community at large and amongst students and faculty. And so I turned it into something that would work for my community, right? You know, if you're a professor trying to do something, you know, people in this community still, you know, despite what the right says, that people really respect, you know, many people in this country really respect intellectual engagement. They value it, they want it. They want it for their own children. They want it for their community members. And so when someone who's doing that work becomes involved in the community, it thickens all the relationships, you know. And also I want it to be in an affirming space, you know. And I feel like mutual aid has been mutual aid, not just for the people that our fund works with, but serves us as well, because it gives me hope, you know. People call me mother. I don't really like it very much, but you know, you know, it's you know, they'll just send out something, hey mom, and I'm like, I am not your mother. But I love that it's kind of ball culture. What Larry was saying earlier, like our community understands that word means so much more, right? And to be honored with that word, you know, that nomenclature, you know, 4 o'clock in the morning when someone needs something, right? And to have that discussion and to be able to help just is amazing. And also to redistribute wealth. So I know I went on a little bit too long, but I love that work. And I think it's the best part of my intellectual life right now.
Amazing. Thank you, Sharon, for sharing that. So I did want to kind of talk about what's been happening at New College of Florida and the recent tenure denials there, because I do think there's something necessary and instructive for us to kind of think about with what's happened there, as well as kind of the conversation that we're having right now. So, you know, for folks who might not be aware and that are listening on the live stream, the Board of Trustees at New College of Florida voted last week to deny tenure to 5 applicants due to what they termed extraordinary circumstances. So this occurred after the 5 applicants had already received approval at every other level in the tenure process. This also happened after DeSantis appointed, you know, a kind of slew of new board of trustees. They were all kind of incredibly conservative and who were interested, you know, speaking to Larry's comments, in turning New College into what they called the Hillsdale of the South, right? Alluding to this kind of conservative Christian college in Michigan that has very deep ties to the Republican Party. So, you know, I think there's a tendency to think about these recent kind of attacks on higher education and academic freedom as mostly targeting the science or the social sciences and humanities, right? These fields that we think of as dealing much more with gender and sexuality and race and other issues of identity like that. But, you know, 2 of the professors who were denied tenure were actually in organic chemistry, and another was in coastal and marine science. So 3 out of the 5 were in what we would kind of call the hard sciences, right? So I'm, you know, wondering about the kind of implications then for how we think about this, you know, and what this might mean for our organizing, right? So like, how do we organize with our colleagues? And I think speaking to some of the comments that you all made earlier, right, this is something that's coming for all of us, right? Whether we're at a public and a private, I think whether we're in STEM or not, or humanities or not, right? So how can we think about this actually as a kind of organizing strategy, right? With like going cross campus and, you know, bridging, I think these kind of divides. So if you all have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, just listening to you talk immediately made me think of the scientist Dick Levins, the father of Aurora Levins Morales and Ricardo Levins Morales, the husband of Rosario Morales, some of the absolutely leading Puerto Rican diaspora thinkers. And Dick Levins, of course, was a leftist, committed, progressive Jewish scientist who was intimidated and harassed precisely because he had a very expansive and complex view of society. And he really saw his scientific work as tied to what happens in communities. So it is absolutely a mistake to think that these debates, that these conservative laws do not impact people across the spectrum of the university. They absolutely do, regardless of your personal politics. So in this case, people were being penalized for going up early for tenure. So they were being dismissed. But there are people in the sciences that are profoundly committed to the social justice issues that we have been addressing. And I think it really behooves us to be coalitional. It behooves us to understand the complexity. It behooves us to understand how everybody is implicated and how everybody needs to step up. Because these attacks are constant. They happen in very different ways. In some cases, they happen attacks at elementary level education. So they can happen in terms of the possibility of teaching evolution and science and biology. So the fact is that really all of us are impacted. So thanks for pointing that out.
Monica, go for it.
Yeah, we here have been having that very conversation, and I've been heartened to see that there has been quite a lot of like cross campus, cross universities, cross discipline organizing. I mean, it's easy with the question of tenure, right? Because tenure affects everybody and but it's also happening around the question of DEI, right? And these anti-DEI policies, because a lot of the science grants require a kind of built-in DEI function, right? And they explicitly asked, like, what is your DEI plan? How do you, how are you incorporating scientists from diverse backgrounds? And so I think on our campus, the discussion has been really, really healthy because it's very clear that, yes, our teaching perhaps is more overtly, has more of a target on its back, but the work that a lot of people in STEM are doing requires, whether they want to or not, right? It requires them to engage these conversations. Anecdotally, we had a scientist here who was a Black woman who was denied a grant, a fairly large grant, because the committee sort of wrote, like, we're not sure you can do this sort of your DEI plan and your plan for sort of race within your grant at Texas. So it's already, we already are sort of seeing that the rhetoric even is spreading out, right? And affecting people in the sciences as well as in the humanities and social sciences. So you're absolutely right. And I think the conversations have to be broad. What I hope that, even if the kind of the tenure stuff gets taken off the table because it's so obviously going to impact the kind of prestige of these universities in Texas. I hope that our colleagues in STEM will continue to sort of support the other parts of these, right? The anti-trans organizing, the organizing against anti-trans higher ed bills, the organizing against anti-CRT bills, right? Because those two have that impact, right? Even if it seems sort of less obvious to their teaching and their fields, as Larry pointed out, right? So I hope the conversations continue, and I've so far been hopeful about the way that this is playing out here in Texas.
So we're almost at time, but I do want to conclude with, we've gotten a couple of questions in the chat from folks who are at what they would say relatively or temporarily safe states or private institutions that really want to know what they can do to support. So folks on the ground in places like Florida, in Texas, and North Carolina, if folks want to get plugged in and folks want to be in solidarity, how can they do that?
I mean, extend your networks, your resources. I have grad students who are looking for work, right? Maybe your institutions have, positions, or, just thinking about the kinds of resources that folks in relatively safe private institutions, how could you access resources that we could funnel to our students who are bearing the brunt of this?
Partner with us.
Yeah.
Partner with us on grants, partner with us for DEI initiatives, pull us into more national work.
So if people are interested in learning more about the graduate employment organization strike at the University of Michigan, I would invite them to visit the website geo3550.org. So GEO, Graduate Employee Organization, 3550.org, O-R-G.
And I would just say that keep talking about this stuff and keep talking about what's really at stake, right? I think what Sharon pointed to was really important, is that there's all these little hidden things in these bills and the way that they're trying to sort of change all of these various aspects of our lives that, we're focused on the big thing, right? They're very sneaky. They make us focus on this big thing, and in the back door, they're sticking all these other things in there in laws that, that we're not aware of. So keep talking about it and keep sort of talking about what really is at stake, right? Because what's very clear is that the disinformation, right, or the sort of reduction of our work to like these three acronyms is very effective, right? So we have to counter that very forcefully. And I think that's right now the best thing, one of the best things that we can be doing.
Great. Thank you all so much. And I just really want to thank you for sharing with us today and your insights and just being here in community. It's really powerful. And thank you all to everyone who's on the live stream for joining us. And this is a conversation that definitely the American Studies Association, Puerto Rican Studies Association are interested in continuing. And to those of you who are in states that are dealing with these issues, please feel free to reach out to the PRSA and the ASA. We want to partner with you and figure out how we can support scholars and academic laborers on the ground in those places. So thank you and have a great afternoon.